Hi everyone. So today we are going to talk about advertising. And there are a few different subjects on the theme of advertising that I'd like to bring up. And so we'll deal with these one by one. First, I'd like to talk about deception in advertising. Then I'd like to talk about manufactured demand and the differences between exogenous and endogenous preferences. And lastly, like to talk about targeted advertising and marketing and the harms associated with that. Okay, first let's talk about deception. I think sometimes people think about advertising in the following way. You definitely don't want to lie to people. Lying to people is wrong. You can't lie to people. But as long as you're not lying to people, then you're good to go. So you can't just say something that you know or believe to be false about some product. That's not okay. But as long as you're saying stuff that you believe or saying stuff that you know, then you're in good shape. Um, Now, yeah, I think lying is, or at least is usually wrong. On the one hand, it can be a legal liability if you have an advertisement for Listerine, say, which lies about its medical benefits. You could, the manufacturers of Listerine could be sued for running such an advertisement. Um, but even if you're not legally liable, even if you don't end up getting sued for lying in some advertisement, you think, well, markets depend on trust between uh, the parties to any given transaction, and the more you lie, the more this trust breaks down. And the more trust breaks down, the higher the transaction costs. You know, you need to take out some insurance or take extra steps to make sure that people are telling the truth. Or if you're incapable of taking those extra steps or taking out that insurance, you just don't transact with the person at all. So markets depend on trust, and lying undermines trust, even if it's not legally prosecuted or doesn't come up with any sort of official sanction. Okay, but lying isn't the only type of deception. There are ways of deceiving people that go beyond lying, and they are uh, morally problematic. They raise the same sorts of moral problems uh, uh, because they also tend to undermine trust in a market, and that's a problem. Okay, so um, let's consider some of the varieties of deception. Okay, so what do we mean when we say lying? Well, I think different people have different things in mind, but one way of defining a lie is to say that a lie is when you say something that you don't believe or that you believe to be false. So somebody asks me what time it is, and I know that it's 2 o'clock, but I say that it's 10 o'clock for some reason or other. Somebody asks me what ingredients are in some product I'm selling, and I know that the product is made of water and alcohol, but I say that it has some magical elixir or something or other. It has all sorts of ingredients it doesn't contain. Okay. So lying is one way to deceive people, to say something that you don't believe or that you believe, in fact, to be false. Okay. But there are other ways of deceiving people. One way to deceive people is through implication, through meaning something, communicating something, without actually saying it out loud. So there are a lot of different ways of meaning things without saying them. So you have all sorts of figures of speech or metaphors or uh, irony and sarcasm and so on. Um, um, a standard example in the philosophy of language of meaning something without saying it is, suppose that I'm asked by a student. I would, by the way, absolutely never do this. This is super fucked up. But suppose that I'm asked by a student to write a letter of recommendation, but I have nothing good to say about this student. And so my letter of recommendation says, Smith has excellent handwriting and is very punctual. Sincerely, Ian. And now, suppose that you got that letter of recommendation if you were an employer or another school or something like that. What would you think? You would think, well, this person isn't saying out loud that Smith is a bad student or is incompetent or whatever, but that's what it's getting across because, well, if you had something nicer to say about Smith, you would have said it. So so this letter of recommendation case is an example of meaning something without actually saying it explicitly. And you know, there are all sorts of forms that this can take. Um, um, but this is one way of deceiving people, is not actually saying something explicitly, but meaning it without saying it explicitly. Another form of deception amounts to misleading claims, where you don't necessarily mean anything false. You're not telling somebody something false or asserting something false, but you're misleading people in one way or another. You're giving people a message which you are in a position to know is going to lead them to some false conclusions. So the misleading claims can take a couple of forms. On the one hand, the claims in an ad can themselves be misleading. There are a bunch of examples of this, but maybe you could call some medicine doctor recommended, or some toothpaste doctor recommended. Well, what does doctor recommended mean? Well, literally it means it was recommended by some doctor. So all a toothpaste needs in order to be doctor recommended is that some doctor somewhere in the world recommended that somebody use that toothpaste. But, you know, when you say doctor recommended, you know that people are going to infer, or people are going to get the impression that lots of doctors recommend it, or the majority of doctors recommend it, or some consensus among doctors is that this is the toothpaste to use. And so you can, without actually saying those things explicitly or even meaning them, you can lead people in that direction, and therefore you can mislead people. You can lead people to a false conclusion. One of my favorite examples of this has to do with ingredients lists on the backs of packaged foods. So maybe you'll get a piece of candy or something that says natural strawberry flavor. You think, well, what's natural strawberry flavor? Well, it's natural, it's not artificial, it's strawberry flavor. So I guess it's some kind of like essence of strawberries, and it's dried strawberries or strawberry juice or strawberry oil or something like that. But no, that's not what natural strawberry flavor is. Natural strawberry flavor just means it's a natural flavor, so it occurs naturally rather than being produced in a lab. And it's strawberry flavor, so it tastes like strawberries. But natural strawberry flavor doesn't, by legal statute, have to actually come from strawberries at all. So when you said that something contains natural strawberry flavor, did you mean that, or say explicitly or implicitly that it comes from the flavor is derived from strawberries directly? Maybe not. But one way or another, you're misleading people. You're giving people a message. You're saying something which is going to, lead people to a false conclusion. It's going to lead people to think that this contains some strawberry derivative when it, in fact, does not. Food photography can be a good example here. So a claim can be something that you make using like English, right? You can say it out loud or write it out loud, or write it out loud, that's not a thing. You can say it out loud or write it in words, but you can also make claims, you can assert things and tell people things using images and sounds. So food photography is a really good example of this. So the picture of the mac and cheese on the cover of the Stouffer's box could make it look like the most delicious mac and cheese you've ever seen in your life, right? But then you open the package and you see that it's this sort of gray blob of, weird sauce and yucky noodles or whatever. Whatever, I don't care. Maybe Stouffer's is fine, I don't give a shit. But one way or another, the picture on the front of the package does not match what's actually inside the package. Food stylists that work for commercial ad agencies will add grill marks to things that don't usually have grill marks. They'll make things that are actually quite cold look very hot because they've been sitting out in a photo studio all day. But they'll put some dry ice or something nearby, so it looks like they're steaming. Or they'll make a beverage, which is actually room temperature, look cold by putting little beads of sweat on the little perspiration, condensation on the side of a glass. Okay, now this isn't necessarily wrong. I mean, it's perhaps misleading, but harmlessly, to put little drops of fake condensation on the side of a glass of warm seltzer or something like that. But there are other ways of misleading people through food photography, leading people to believe that something is going to look much more delicious than it actually looks once it shows up, that are harmful, that do undermine trust in the market. So that's one way that a claim can be misleading. You can mislead people. You can say something that you know is going to lead people in a certain direction, encourage people to draw some inference, which is false. You can also mislead people not about the claims that you're making, but you can mislead people about the fact that you're making an advertisement at all. So the Truth in Advertising timeline had some examples of this. In the early days of Instagram influencers, people would pay Selena Gomez or Kim Kardashian or I don't know, Drake or something to promote their products on their Instagram accounts or their Twitter accounts or whatever, but they would just make it look like they use these products naturally in the course of their lives. Or, you can have good. I'll leave it at there. I was going to mention product placement in movies, but that's a slightly different phenomenon. It can be misleading, but it's a different sort of thing. As you're dealing with like fictional characters, not real people. One other, I think, probably more insidious version of this although so there's regulation about now influencers, if they're paid for an advertisement, they have to put hashtag ad or hashtag sponsored or whatever promotion at the end of a post. They have to indicate now, but legally, they have to indicate whether something is an advertisement or whether they were paid to say something. Although, the lines are a little blurry here. You might have a journalist who interviews somebody about their skincare routine, and the person says that they use some products that they have some marketing relationship with, and they don't have to say that it's an ad in that context. So there are still ways that you can sort of effectively be advertising something, and be paid to advertise something, but you mislead people about whether you're being paid, whether you're making these claims authentically or without being prompted otherwise. Branded content is another example of this. So maybe you'll see like on a website that you read, there's some like sponsored post, and it's like it might. Maybe it says very clearly that it's a sponsored post, and maybe it has all sorts of red flags throughout it, which sort of indicate that this is not really the authentic beliefs of this brand or this author. But sometimes branded content, and then it looks like a normal newspaper article, and then halfway through it starts going on and on about how great Facebook is or how great Clorox is or whatever. And you're like, wait a second, is this an ad? More insidiously, the New York Times Magazine used to be really bad about this. So they would have like whole advertising spreads that were formatted exactly like normal New York Times Magazine articles, but they were advertisements. They were advertisements for some good or service. And so they were misleading people. They never said explicitly, this is a New York Times Magazine article or whatever, but they were clearly misleading people. They were formatting the image in a certain way to lead people to believe that this was a thing that was written sort of unbidden by the journalists working for the New York Times, who don't have any particular axe to grind, or they're not being paid or whatever. They're impartial, they're objective, or something like that. but in fact, it's an advertisement. So branded content, I think, is a real minefield when it comes to misleading people about whether something is an advertisement at all. And lastly, you might say, this is another way to deceive people. You might say something that you actually believe, but for which you have no good evidence. So, in the Truth in Advertising timeline, they give the example of Skechers making advertisements saying that it was would help tone people's muscles, better than the average shoe, I guess. Airborne making claims about the efficacy of Airborne in fighting the cold. Palm making all sorts of claims about erectile dysfunction, the health benefits of pomegranate juice. Okay, it could be the case, charitably interpreted, the people who wrote these ads really did believe what they were saying. If we're interpreting them charitably, if we're not being too cynical, these people really did believe what they were saying. The people who make Airborne really did believe that it had such and such properties, that it really was effective in fighting colds in such and such ways. But this can still be, you can still say something that you actually believe and still deceive people. Well, why is that? Well, usually when you say something, when you assert something, when you make some claim confidently, part of what you're also communicating, part of what you're also getting across is that you have enough evidence to make that claim, that you're in a position to make that claim, that people can trust you when you make that claim, and can and should trust you when you make that claim. But if you're making a claim without this sort of evidence, a claim that you're not really in a position to make, a claim about which you are not, in fact, trustworthy, this is a way to deceive people. So, okay, so there are 4 ways of deceiving people that go, and some of them go beyond just straight up lying to people. So you can lie, you can say something explicitly that you don't believe or that you know to be false. You can implicate something false, you don't make it explicit, but it's part of what you're getting across anyway, perhaps through irony or metaphor or some other figure of speech. You can make a misleading claim. Either the contents of the claim itself are misleading, or you're misleading people about what sort of claim it is. Is it an advertisement at all, for example? And lastly, you can make a claim which you might well believe, but you make it with insufficient evidence. Okay. So, to summarize again, if the main problem with lying is that it undermines trust in a market, and trust is a key feature of markets. It's a sine qua non. It's something that without which markets fall apart, or the transaction costs get jacked up. These are all ways of all these forms of deception also come with the same sorts of harms, and so they should, except when you're in extraordinary circumstances, I guess, be avoided. Okay. Let's turn a little bit to the question of manufacturer demand. So hopefully you watched that little video about bottled water. And, there are a lot of complaints that you could make about bottled water, that it's bad for the environment, that the relationship between water bottler companies and the local governments in places where they actually acquire the water are unhealthy or corrupt in one way or another. You could argue that people are just wasting their money when people buy bottled water. There are all sorts of problems that you could point to with bottled water. But one interesting feature of bottled water, one really interesting feature, is that a few decades ago, nobody wanted bottled water. If you tried to sell somebody bottled water a few decades ago, they would say, in the United States at least, they would say very reasonably, huh? There's a water fountain over there, and I've got tap water over here, and I have a water bottle at home. I guess I could always just take the water with me. Why would I want to buy a disposable water bottle when there's so much effectively free water all around me? Okay. And yet, in the last few decades, something has changed dramatically. People who previously thought they had no need for bottled water all of a sudden have quite a great need for bottled water. Bottled water sales have gone up tremendously. It's bottled water advertisers have convinced people that bottled water is something they need, something that's good for them. Okay, so this is, Leonard calls this manufactured demand. So it's not that the product itself is being manufactured, it's the demand, desire for the product is being manufactured. Economists sometimes call these sorts of desires, this sort of demand, endogenous. So I want to take a little bit of a, zoom out a little bit and not just focus on the case of bottled water in particular. I want to talk about the differences between exogenous and endogenous preferences in general. Okay, what am I talking about? Well, here's the main point for starters. Not all desires are the same. So some things are things you would want regardless of the circumstances in which you live and regardless of the circumstances in which you developed and grew up. So people want nourishment. They want to survive. They want bodily pleasure. They want, or perhaps emotional or spiritual pleasure. They want to minimize their own pain and suffering. No matter where you grew up, I mean, maybe you can convince yourself culturally for some reason or other not to have these desires, but the default, these are sort of the natural default desires. They're not desires that come from your upbringing or from the culture that you grew up in or the particular society in which you live or anything like that. These are desires that people have independent of their particular cultural context, their particular circumstances. Economists sometimes call these desires exogenous. They're exogenous means, maybe you've heard this word before, maybe you haven't, but exogenous means developed outside. The idea is that the exogenous preferences, exogenous wants and desires, are preferences that developed outside of your specific culture, the markets you participate in, the political institutions that govern you, and so on. Hold on a second. It's a little noisy in here. I'm just going to close the window. Okay, great. On the other hand, some things are things that you want only because of the circumstances in which you live and grew up. So your taste in food and entertainment is largely determined by your culture. You know, what sorts of movies do you like to see? What sorts of things do you like to eat? These are things that you only enjoy, that you only prefer because of your upbringing. So at least in large part, maybe you're naturally predisposed to like some types of music rather than others, but you would only have developed a taste for, you know, say, heavy metal or punk rock if you grew up in a specific sort of environment. People only want bottled water and Supreme clothes, for example, because of how they've been marketed. You know, if you didn't know that Supreme was a cool and desirable brand, would you pay anything more for a sweatshirt that says Supreme on it than a sweatshirt that doesn't say Supreme on it? Maybe you think that the word Supreme is kind of cool, you know, independently of Supreme's marketing campaign. But, you know, nobody would be spending lots and lots of money on Supreme sweatshirts or Supreme hats unless they had been exposed to the culture and marketing surrounding Supreme. Okay. Economists sometimes call these endogenous preferences as opposed to exogenous preferences because they developed inside your cultural, economic, political circumstances. Okay. So there's an important difference between exogenous and endogenous preferences. One reason why it's important is for sort of theoretical reasons in economics. I think economists have largely treated consumers, people's preferences as kind of independent of the markets in which they participate. But of course, people's preferences aren't all independent of the markets in which they participate. There are all sorts of things that you want only because you are being sold them, or your friends are being sold them, and so on. Okay. That's one reason why this distinction is useful, is that it's been sort of largely ignored by economists in the past, or to the extent that economists in the past have sort of ignored the possibility of endogenous preferences. This is a weakness in economic theory. But there's another, I think, more philosophically important reason why this distinction matters, why you'd want to know this distinction or have a handle on it. Here's the philosophical question that's sort of in the background. Some of our desires are good for us in the sense that satisfying them makes our lives better. Some of these could be, so for example, I don't have a dishwasher at home, and I don't like doing dishes, and I spend a lot of time doing dishes. My life would be considerably easier if I had a dishwasher. And so, I would spend less time doing the stuff that I don't like doing. This is a desire which is sort of connected to my well-being in a certain way. If I actually satisfied my desire for a dishwasher, that is to say, if I actually got a dishwasher, I would be better off, I think. Some of our desires, on the other hand, are not good for us, in the sense that satisfying them doesn't make our lives better. So, it's controversial what sorts of what might count as an example of this. But you want, here's a possible example. You want the new iPhone, but you get it, and it turns out it's basically the same as the old iPhone. Maybe it's a little bit worse in some respects because of hostile design, which we've talked about in the past. And also, you're out the $1,000 or $800 or whatever it is that an iPhone costs. Okay, so that's or maybe you want to play some new video game, and then you play the game and it turns out to be boring. Okay, so sometimes we want things, and actually satisfying those desires actually getting what we want doesn't make our lives better. Okay, so we have two distinctions on our hands. There's the distinction between exogenous preferences and endogenous preferences. And there's the distinction between desires which are good for us and desires which are not good for us. What do those two distinctions have to do with each other? Well, it's not a clear one-to-one mapping, right? It's not like the only desires that are good for you are the exogenous desires, and all of your endogenous desires are bad for you. After all, my desire for a dishwasher, perhaps a particular brand of dishwasher, might be endogenous. It might be created by the markets in which I participate. It might have been created by an advertisement. Some advertiser told me about a dishwasher, and in fact, this dishwasher would be good for me if I were to have it. It would make my life better. Okay, so some endogenous preferences, some endogenous desires are actually good for us. Maybe all of our exogenous desires are good for us. I'm not entirely sure that's something to think about. But a lot of our endogenous preferences, it seems, a lot of them, if not all of them, but a lot of them, are not tied to our well-being in the appropriate way. They're not actually good for us. So, we talk about keeping up with the Joneses, wanting something not because it's actually good for you, but just because the people around you have it, and so you get jealous or something like that. Or wanting bottled water. People wouldn't waste thousands of dollars a year on, or, hundreds of dollars a year, whatever it is, billions of dollars in the aggregate, across all of the world, on bottled water if they just took water bottles from home. It would be better for the environment, for starters, but it would also be better for them. They don't need the bottled water. They've got free water at home. Of course, there are caveats here. Some places the water is dangerous to drink. and sometimes you don't have the opportunity to get a water bottle from home or something like that. But, you know, in very, very many cases, people who buy water bottles would have been better off just taking bottled water from home, or perhaps buying something other than water. Okay. Or going to a water fountain or whatever it is. So sometimes our endogenous preferences, especially preferences created by marketing, created by advertising, created by anxiety about what other people have, what other people are getting in on that we're not participating in. These desires, it seems like, can often be bad for us. They're not, even if they were satisfied, they wouldn't make our lives better off. Okay. How do you tell the difference between, so within endogenous preferences, you've got a question, well, some endogenous preferences seem to be bad for us. Some of them seem to be good for us. So how do you tell the difference? You know, I'm not sure. That's an open philosophical question. I think it's a question you might want to answer yourself. If some advertising campaign manufactures demand, if it creates endogenous preferences on the part of consumers, will the consumers actually be better off if they get the thing that's being advertised to them, or not? Well, how do you answer that question? Again, I don't know. Maybe one proposal is that maybe the endogenous preferences have to be tied to your exogenous preferences in some way or other. So there's no kind of pre-existing desire I have which is satisfied when I try to keep up with the Joneses, say, when I want to get whatever new gizmo or new piece of furniture or whatever it is that my neighbors have. And so, you know, keeping up with the Joneses is bad for you because it's not connected to your pre-existing desires. Maybe it's bad for you because it's not pleasurable. You don't actually get, you know, the Marie Kondo thing, you know, does this spark joy? Okay. I will just point to this because to the extent that advertising creates endogenous preferences for things that are not good for us, and since those things cost money, things that will actively harm us because we'll lose money by buying them, advertisements are in a position to harm people in this distinctive way. And so this is something that, while it's hard to say in general how to avoid creating the wrong sorts of endogenous preferences, it's something that's worth thinking about. If we're going to manufacture desires, manufacture demand on the parts of consumers, are we manufacturing demand that's good for them or that's not good for them? Something to think about. Okay. Lastly, I want to turn to questions having to do with targeted advertising and product design and marketing. Okay. So some products, so the BuzzFeed listicle of pointlessly gendered products is sort of funny and mostly funny and a little bit sad. The piece about dinner time and about the history of McDonald's is sort of targeted marketing to black people in the United States. You know, with these things, sometimes you can find them ridiculous, sometimes you can find them outrageous, sometimes you can find them just a little creepy, but it's hard to pin down exactly what's creepy about them or why you are sort of morally suspicious of these things in. I think there are two possible reasons why, maybe more than two, but two possible reasons why we might be sort of morally suspicious of marketing that's targeted to particular identity groups. One possibility is that there could be some inequity in how these goods are priced at in different markets or for different demographic groups. So health insurance for many years prior to the Affordable Care Act, prior to Obamacare, was much more expensive for women than it is for men, in part because women have to go to gynecologists and obstetricians. There are certain medical services which women need, which men don't need. And so there's some inequity in pricing there. You think, well, if the whole point of health insurance is that we're sort of sharing the social burden of medical care and looking out for one another and preventing people from having to pay things that they can't afford or pay for medical care that they can't afford. Okay, so it seems like disproportionately putting medical costs on women, which are ultimately the costs of just living in a human society. This seems like it might be. This seems like it might be unfair. I mean, we could have a conversation about whether this was actually fair after all, but it's sort of a moot point now. It's against the law to charge women more for medical care or for health insurance. Consumer advocates have pointed to the pink tax, what they call the pink tax. Sometimes goods which are identical goods, which is, we're not talking about healthcare here, identical goods which are marketed to women are just cost more than the exact same goods which are marketed to men. There's the idea is that there's a pink tax. There are sort of hidden costs of being alive in the world in 2020 that come with being a woman, and there could you might think this is unjust for all sorts of reasons. Maybe you think that it's a type of inequality that isn't justified by its benefits to the rest of the world in the way that Rawls might require, for example. Okay, so one possible concern that you could have about targeted product design and targeted marketing is that it could lead to inequity in prices, and that this is unfair or unjust, and so you want to look out for that when you're especially doing product design. Okay, so another possible concern is that you could perpetuate dangerous stereotypes. So, why do we think that girls like pink and boys like blue? Fun fact, 150 years ago, in Victorian England and parts of the United States, the color associations were the opposite. Baby blue was sort of thought of as like a soft, effeminate, cloudy color, and pink was like a vibrant, masculine, energetic color. There's a similar point to be made about high heels. High heels used to be worn primarily by men rather than by women, but I won't go there. So if these colors were associated with the opposite gender 150 years ago or so, why are they associated with boys and girls now? Why do girls like pink? Why do boys like blue? Well, it's largely because of marketing. Pink stuff is sold to girls. Blue stuff is sold to boys. We could have a long, difficult conversation about which gender differences are sort of created by society and which gender differences are created by biology or something like that. But that's a harder conversation than we need to have right now. All we need to say right now is that sometimes harmful stereotypes can be perpetuated by marketing and advertising. That for example, the stereotypes that women are softer, more delicate, more emotionally neurotic, more prone to wild swings of emotion, that they need to live sort of more cloistered, protected, swaddled lives than men. These sorts of stereotypes can be promoted by advertising and promoted by marketing design, or by product design, excuse me. And these stereotypes are dangerous. Similarly, with the part of perhaps if you were creeped out by sort of made uncomfortable by those McDonald's advertisements marketing to black people in the United States in the 70s. It's sort of like there's, you might ask, what are the, well, one reason why you might be upset by them is that, McDonald's is just bad for you. So McDonald's is just, you're upset by it because McDonald's is, poisoning black people at higher rates than it's poisoning white people. But setting aside the quality of the product that McDonald's is selling, you might ask, like, well, are there any potentially harmful or dangerous stereotypes which are being promoted by these advertisements? Stereotypes about black delinquency, stereotypes about dysfunctional black families, stereotypes about how cheap or dishonest black people are. Okay, it's like it makes me kind of uncomfortable to talk about these stereotypes because it's hard to even acknowledge the existence of these stereotypes without sounding a little bit racist. But I'm putting the stereotypes out there. I'm not saying that I actually endorse them. Okay. So if you're creeped out by these advertisements, maybe what creeps you out is the sense that they somehow perpetuate or buy into dangerous stereotypes about black folks in the United States. Okay. So far in this video, we haven't talked much about solutions to the problems that we're addressing. But I'll just throw one out there that's worth considering. In disability activism, there's a slogan which goes around that says, "Nothing about us without us." Nothing about us without us. And the thought is that, if you're going to do a study of autistic people or people with some hearing disability, say, then you would want autistic people or hearing disabled people to participate not just in the study as subject, but participate in the study in the design. So nothing about us without us. The thought is that you don't want to there's something, it can often be, if not, this is perhaps possible to take this slogan too far, but it can often be dangerous or damaging or sort of objectifying or demobilizing to a group of people to sort of treat them as subjects or targets without actually including them in your own decision making. And so I think this especially goes for advertising. So one way to avoid, so to take an example from a little while back, what was the name of the brand? Was it Abercrombie or something? There was some clothing brand a couple of years ago which caught a lot of shit because there was they had a little marketing campaign, or they were selling T-shirts for children, and the T-shirt in this marketing campaign, the T-shirt that the little black kid was wearing in these photos said "little monkey" on it. And of course, there's a long, nasty history of calling black people monkeys and associating blackness with animality and being subhuman. And so this brand, I forget what the name of the brand was. It doesn't matter though. The brand caught a lot of shit for this. I mean, they got in a lot of trouble. They pulled the ad. It cost them all sorts of sponsors and partners of some sort or other. One way they could have prevented this is by having people who are sensitive to these sorts of concerns, who are sensitive to, for example, being called a monkey by some racist, and involved in the design of the ad campaign. So, one way that you can avoid dangerously stereotyping black folks, Latin folks, Asian folks, women, disabled people, immigrants, whatever, is by including members of those groups in the design of advertising campaigns marketed to them. Okay, so much for that. That's my one suggestion for a solution this week. We will turn next time to whistleblowing. We'll talk about whistleblowing in the Olympus scandal. Okay, thanks a lot. Hope that wasn't too painful. See you next time.